Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to A Whole Lotta Gray. I'm your host, Anish Anandaram, and my next guest is very special one. He's an eminent lawyer at the Supreme Court of India. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Sai Deepak. Sai, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure being with you.
So, I wanted to jump right into it. A big faction of my listeners are either lawyers or aspiring lawyers themselves. So what's your story? How did you decide to practice the law, especially after initially pursuing the route of engineering? How did you decide to make that switch?
I think I was fairly set on a career in engineering. Especially my intention was to pursue a master's in aerospace engineering after my undergraduate in mechanical engineering. That was the clear intention. And in fact, I was interested in pursuing that in America, and that was the direction in which my preparation and my efforts were, let's say, invested in. And I think between 2004 and 2005 end, I went through a polarizing phase in terms of the kind of discourse that was taking shape around me. And as someone who's always been politically aware and politically conscious and interested to a significant extent, at least in the discourse and the tone and tenor of it, I was not sure if engineering was where my future lay, and therefore I decided to ask myself a few honest questions about whether I wanted to lead the private life of an engineer, and if I wanted to use India as a stepping stone and go towards greener pastures, literally and figuratively, in the US. And that's when I decided to ask myself, what are the other options if not engineering? So civil services and law were the two options that immediately struck me as the most visible options, which could perhaps give me the skill sets needed to contribute to public discourse. I opted against civil services for multiple reasons. One is that perhaps it is not the kind of atmosphere that an outspoken person can be a part of. Right. And given that it calls for a lot of compromise, and with the changing political wind every day, you need to tout out to the politician whether or not he knows the subject. And that's something that I wasn't sure I was capable of doing. Plus, I wanted to understand the legal framework, let's call it the legal neural framework of the country. And that's one of the reasons that I was heavily biased towards the law. And fortunately, that's the period when IIT Kharagpur introduced the program for engineers, doctors, and MDs with a science background, namely the bachelor's in law with a specialization in intellectual property rights. And that program effectively caught my attention. And the more I read about it and the more I asked myself if this is the direction that I wish to take, I was convinced that that is perhaps what I was meant to do. And I realized that I got a sense of purpose the moment I entered the program. Wow. And by God's grace, and God's in plural, I'm very happy that I made the switch.
Right. And I'm sure a lot of us are happy you made the switch as well. So one thing I wanted to ask you, you say that, after a lot of thinking, deep thinking about, okay, is this the trajectory I want my career to take, from say aeronautics in America versus, practicing in India. At any point, was there a conflict in identity? Do you think over time, your, recognition of your Indian identity became a lot stronger and became a lot more grounded? Or is that something, have you always been, an immensely proud Indian?
No, so I have never had a sense of conflict. Even if I had ultimately gone to the US instead of opting for law, I would have come back to India. That is the sense that I think I had even then. I don't think I had any doubts about the fact that my karma bhumi was Bharat. There was no two ways about it at all. The question was, do I equip myself with engineering skill sets, or do I get into public life in a slightly different way, not through the conventional means? So I don't think I would have ever survived in any other country simply because I don't think I'm interested in any other country other than India. And this is the only region that I'm interested in contributing, because I think if you contribute to this subcontinent or this region of the world, you can effectively change the fortunes of the future, not only because the epicenter of global history has changed, but also because I think India and the Bharat of yore still has a lot to contribute to the global pool of. That's the intuitive, let's say, sentiment which has always driven me. And now I think I'm in a much better position to articulate something that I've always known. So I think through law, I have found the means to give, let's say, flesh and blood character to my thoughts. And I'm in a much better position to capture where I stand, why I stand, and how I stand. So I'm extremely happy that I made the decision, and I have no doubts about the fact, because see, it's not pursuing law for India. The thing is, I can still, with this degree, go anywhere in the world and continue to practice, given my standing in the profession and given what I can do. That's a different issue altogether.
Right.
But the question is, what skill sets did I feel were appropriate for me to acquire, and what is it that I was best cut out for or suited for? Right. And these two effectively told me that if I really wanted to contribute here, the battleground here is on ideology and largely around what the Constitution says, because the discussion around constitutional morality started taking the kind of pitch that we're seeing today. It has its origins in 2000s, in early 2000s. And that's when I think this entire discussion about the Constitution caught my fancy.
Very interesting. And thank you for that answer. So I want to touch upon something you briefly mentioned is, you said, I always knew that Bharat was where my heart was at. And I always knew ultimately, regardless of what trajectory I took, all roads would kind of take me back to India, right? Do you think that currently that feeling of, proud Indic identity and feeling of Indianness in the age of globalization that we're currently in, do you think it stands to get stronger among the younger demographics, or is it at risk of getting eradicated? What's your 2 cents on it?
I think we are looking at the bottom of the curve in terms of the decline. We are reaching the bottom of the curve. And I think my generation will effectively start seeing the upsurge. The tide will turn in my generation is not just my optimism, but I think there are enough markers around us to tell us that this is going to happen. Because you have to realize that despite being under 70 years of a non-Indic dispensation, a non-Indic colonialist mindset, if youngsters and people in my age group, which is in mid-30s and early 30s, have still managed to retain their Indic filter and have still managed to retain their belief in the spirit of this land and what it has to contribute. And what is even more surprising is that in what you expect to be a deracinated tradition, there are even more people learning Sanskrit. There are even more people who are actually reading up books of history from primary sources, and whom I have had the opportunity to interact with and learn from. It tells me that despite lack of traditional institutions to guide us in that direction, the spirit of this land is giving a resistance to the non-Indic mindset and is saying that my time has come, make way for it. So I have no doubt about the fact that one, that's the way of the future. Second, I believe that it continues to be relevant, but I certainly don't subscribe to any European notion of nationalism as applied to India. I think Bharat's approach to nationhood, statehood, and civilization are completely different. And that's the framework that we must all start understanding so that we get out of this left-right binary.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I just wanted to ask you for your 2 cents on that, because I think our listeners will greatly benefit. Do you think most Indians today, across generations, kind of make the mistake of applying European frameworks and European context to the unique Indian cultural lens?
So, I'm actually in the midst of writing a piece, notwithstanding the fact that it is bound to be published day after tomorrow. Let me actually disclose the substratum of the piece.
Perfect. I'll make sure in the description below also. So.
Sure. Okay. So I think what has happened is the mindset that gave birth to the Constitution was a mixed mindset for a different reason. That the Congress effectively became the political organization which attracted people of all shades and hues. So the Congress at that time was neither entirely left nor right nor center. It was effectively a mixed hodgepodge or a pig's breakfast of everything under the sun. Okay, so you had representation of various hues, but the tone and tenor that the organization took after 1947, and I think from the day Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru became the Prime Minister until 1964, and in fact I would say right until 1977, when the first non-Congress establishment effectively occupied power in the center. That particular period has deeply affected India's psyche. And like our traffic rules, our default position has been keep left. Okay. And that, I think, is largely responsible for what we take for granted, what we assume is the normal. And that norm and that normative position is what is now being challenged and called into question, because that normal has effectively bought into every colonial and colonialist trope of Indian civilization and Indian identity. And therefore, the current movement challenging that status quo must be seen as part of the decolonialist movements across the world, where every post-colonial society is ridding itself of colonial, let's say, influence under the framework of decoloniality. Okay, right. And the literature on this particular subject actually suggests that there is a clear distinction between decolonization and decoloniality. Decolonization is to be rid of the colonial influence, direct influence, but decoloniality effectively translates to ridding yourself of the mental slavery of the colonial mindset. Okay, and not rejecting it in entirety if there is something good to offer, but realizing that there is something of value in your past and in your roots. And that is what I think is currently happening. So this generation, I think, is the transitional generation, where we slowly start jettisoning this European framework because its weakness and inherent inability to withstand challenge has been exposed by what I call the silent invasion and the death of Europe, the way Douglas Murray also puts it, after the immigration of a huge, or let's say vast swathe of people into the country. It has not been able to put up any kind of resistance. In fact, its own values have been used against it. Right. So I think Bharat is effectively going to provide certain answers, provided it starts investing significantly in its past.
Perfect. So just one quick interjection on that same point. Again, for the benefit of our listeners, the large swaths of people entering Europe is in reference to the recent MENA migration thing happened, right?
Correct.
Perfect. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, given you've just enlightened us all on the kind of the decolonialism and decoloniality mentalities behind this, and why Indic identity is on the up, and we can be optimistic about it. What do you think some of the biggest challenges facing, say, ensuring that younger generations such as myself, even younger than you, people in their 20s, ensuring that we don't fall prey to, that, kind of that self-loathing of I'm not proud of the Indian mindset. And the reality is that there sadly are people in my generation who do harbor that mindset. What do you think the biggest challenges to, converting them, for lack of a better word, and educating them would be?
I would actually say the biggest challenges are those who want to spread this message must equip themselves, and therefore they need to read further about the history of this country in terms, let's say, identified by our native writers who thought like Indians and who thought like Bharatiyas. So that's extremely important. So reading Indian English literature could also mean reading Virat Chaudhary, but I don't think that's the kind of literature that I want to read. Okay, I would prefer to read someone like Radha Kumud Mukherjee. I'd prefer to read somebody like Neelakanta Shastri. I'd prefer to read someone like Jadunath Sarkar. I'd prefer to read these people because they decided to use English as a medium to respond to the colonial mindset, and not because they took pride in knowing English as a language. That is the distinction.
Right.
Okay? And so I would start with trying to share that knowledge. I would start with trying to bring in elements of decoloniality from the global discourse and telling them that this is what is happening across the world. This does not translate to xenophobia. I'm not asking you to spread hatred. I'm not asking you to be divisive. I'm merely asking you to accept the truths of history and stand up for the native voice of this land. And this call for integration and reconciliation based on truth is bound to be bitter for those people who have always hated the truth and who have always sought to run away from it in the name of secularism and whatnot. But ultimately, truth has to prevail over secularism and every other notion, because truth is about facts and secularism is about emotion. Facts must always trump emotion.
No, okay? For sure.
So that is something that I think can make an impact.
No, absolutely. And that's it's great you mentioned, because that's a central theme of this podcast is, prioritizing facts and evidence over raw feelings and emotions. I'm glad you said that. One thing I wanted to now pick your brain on is it's no secret, and I think globally there is consensus on this, that one of the coolest things about being Indian is our sheer diversity, right? I don't think any other country in the world comes remotely close to our diversity. And maybe the United States in terms of ethnic diversity, but that's a different debate in terms of immigration patterns. I'm talking about indigenous sheer diversity, right? And be it culture, cuisine, language, we can go on and on. So given that, right, because of this, there are many disparate sub-identities of being Indian, if you will. You know, like I'm a Dravidian, I'm a Madhva Brahmin, and I am these things before I'm being Indian. And I'm not saying that I consider myself more Madhva Brahmin than Indian, but the reality is like, it's more micro identity than my country, right? And similar for your case and people from the north, and from Assam to Arunachal Pradesh to Bangalore, it's just a whole amalgamation of such sub-identities. What would your message be to, or what are your thoughts on how we can unite under one common Indian identity despite having all these various sub-identities?
Here's where I think it becomes relevant to understand why it is important to see India more as a civilization than a European nation state. Because India never had the need to act as a single political unit until it started encountering those forces which did not subscribe to the notion of Dharma. Okay? So the central notion that binds the Bharatiya state together prior to 1947, or that bounded prior to 1947, was the notion of Dharma. And there are very clear markers for it, as simple as that. I don't want to make it esoteric at 60,000 feet so that people don't understand its practical application. Let's be very, very clear. Assume for a moment, and I'm going to use what is known as the left of center narrative against itself. If their constant allegation has been that Hinduism is equal to caste structure is equal to Hinduism, they must point out the number of regions in this country where the caste structure has not existed. And if caste structure forms the heart and soul of Hinduism, then by default, the presence of caste structure is proof of evidence of Hinduism. That's one. Okay. Second, therefore, the first point therefore translates to a clear religious integrity or religious affiliation. Second, what does this translate to? This actually translates to a legal framework. Okay. Framework with respect to rules of vocation, framework with respect to rules of succession, framework with respect to rules of matrimony. If each of these systems have clear, let's say, resonances across the country, what that translates to is the presence of an accepted legal norm across a geography, which is proof of its civilizational unity, which is proof of its cultural identity. In the most concrete sense possible, what is it that defines a nation state under European, let's say the Eurocentric framework? The existence of political unity or the existence of legal unity. I am saying here that the existence of legal unity is a consequence of the existence of a cultural unity, which in turn is the consequence of the existence of a religious unity. So whether they like it or not, there is a concept of dharma which is different from religion, and therefore when I use religion, when I use dharma, I don't want it to be interchangeable. But unfortunately, the English language is poorer because it has not found a substitute for dharma so far. Okay. Therefore, I'm merely saying that dharma as a code of conduct and as a code of justice, a code of righteousness, effectively is the binding spirit across the country, which has given birth to multiple social systems and legal systems depending on their interpretation of what constitutes dharma. Now, therefore, the individual expression which we see at the local level, at the microcosmic level, is perhaps the telescopic end of that particular culture, and its lens is effectively dharma. Okay? Therefore, there is nothing wrong about us being extremely proud of our religious identities or regional identities, but we must all be very, very clear about the fact that the source, the fount, the Gangotri is dharma. So long as we understand it, there is absolutely no need for us to apologize for who we are as a single civilization. That's point number one. Point number two is you have to realize that the need for India to act as a nation state, as a single political unit, which is approximation of a civilization as a nation state, is because we have had to protect ourselves from neighbors who do not want the existence of Dharma, who are against the existence of Dharma. Therefore, our existence as a single political unit is to ensure that we react as one to those who do not subscribe to what is our civilizational impulse. Okay, so it is more out of necessity, which is why perhaps India is a continent which continues to masquerade as a country. It is a civilizational entity. That much is something that is very, very clear about. And so long as it remains a civilizational entity, there is no conflict between the multiple cultures that continue to exist within it and its claim as a single state. It is a country which has a thriving number of subcultures, and not because multiple waves of immigration, but because this has been the traditional home of these cultures. This is their, let's say, how is it put it? This is their motherland or fatherland, regardless of which notion you subscribe. It's always been their motherland and fatherland.
Fair enough. And I think that's very, very eloquent. So I again would urge all our listeners to pay attention to that fact that being proud of a sub-identity and recognizing that larger Bharatiya banner, as you said, are not mutually exclusive, right? They can go hand in hand.
Correct.
So one thing, I agree with you on the point that there's no direct translation in English for the word Dharma, but just briefly for our non-Indian listeners, how best would you describe Dharma as?
So I think perhaps the Roman or the Latin word jus, use, okay, which translates to just when you Romanize it or Anglicize it, and which effectively is the root for justice, okay, is effectively the word that I would use for it. But you have to understand how this plays itself out. Now, the root concept is not Dharma. The root concept is Rita. From Rita, you get Satya, and from Satya, you get Dharma. Let's not esoterize it. I'll make it very, very simple.
Yeah.
Now, what is the function of these three words, and at which levels do they actually work? So, anyone who's actually had some amount of training in Indian, let's say, Vedic practices or anything, or at least has an idea of it, is bound to tell you that every shloka speaks of manasa, vacha, karmana. Okay. So we strike a distinction between thought, okay, and when you say vacha, it is effectively speech, and karmana, it translates to action, okay. So Rita is effectively the concept of righteousness in thought. Satya is effectively the concept of righteousness in speech, and Dharma is effectively the concept of righteousness in action. Okay. This is effectively our understanding of the concept of a moral code, which we believe is universal, and universal not in the sense that it applies to all races or all nations across the world, but this is the law of the universe. This is our understanding of natural law. Okay, this is our version of natural law. Okay. Second, the concept of justice is different from the idea of justice, and this is important. Most people don't understand this distinction. The idea of justice can be common to several cultures and several civilizations across the world. But the concept of justice and its application is where it varies, because it depends on custom, it depends on practice, it depends on culture, it depends on geography, it depends on experience. Right. Therefore, the life of law is not logic but experience. And that is why customary law, achara, traditions, customs are given so much of importance. Therefore, perhaps the closest term is the concept of justice as understood in Roman jurisprudence to a significant extent. But as I said, that is perhaps similar to the idea of justice, but what it translates to is entirely, let's say, based on our notions of what is right and what is wrong, which is unique to this particular sphere of influence. Okay. So every civilization and every culture has its own sphere of influence. This is the Bharatiya sphere of influence, which applies to the region around the Indian Ocean and going almost, traditionally it goes to the end of Afghanistan, closer to Greater Persia and to Cambodia and other places. But today, of course, it's limited to the nation state of India or the civilizational state of India and shrinking further.
Wow. No, thank you. That's a brilliant explanation. So one thing I wanted to touch upon, which we briefly spoke about earlier on in the conversation, is, so I think, I'm not sure the exact numbers, but I believe that India has the largest number of diaspora Indians overseas. I think there are more diaspora Indians in the United States and the European Union than pretty much like most other, and especially once you include like Singapore, the UAE, the Arab Gulf states, I think our numbers are far more than anyone else. Maybe China comes a close second. But we're either in the top two. So my question to you is, what responsibility do you think that diaspora Indians, say NRIs living in America, or NRIs living in Europe, or NRIs living in Dubai, what role and responsibility do they have in furthering the Indic cause and Indic identity?
I think the question should be the other way around in the first instance, and there's a reason for it. India has benefited significantly from the remittances of the NRIs for close to 50 to 60 years. There is no running away from that fact.
There's no doubt about it.
Okay. And whenever we Indians or anyone who is not an NRI speaks of NRIs, or let's say second or third generation Americans or non-Indians from point of citizenship, people of Indian origin, we seem to ask this question from a position of entitlement.
Right.
Okay. And that, I think, perhaps is the lens that needs to be changed. We can keep blaming them for what we call running away from India and all that. Realistically speaking, as a country which did not have enough options to offer professionally for those who wanted to equip themselves with advanced qualifications, and those who wanted to provide better for their families, simply because the exchange rate was better, and the Nehruvian state was not letting them generate those opportunities and was killing the Indian spirit of enterprise. They had no other option but to look for better pastures.
No, okay? Absolutely. I think
so.
Sorry.
Right.
I agree with you. I think it's very foolish.
Yeah, go on, please.
Especially like you said, during a time when the Nehruvian framework was really, 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 hindering our ability to enterprise and work hard.
Right.
I agree with you on that. But do continue.
So he imposes a centralized Soviet structure and then calls it the Hindu rate of growth, does not let the Hindus actually explore and flex their muscles on the entrepreneurial front. So once the state as it existed is clearly to be held responsible for the state of affairs and for the brain drain that we witnessed, what we must be grateful for is that they continue to look out for their families, and states like Kerala have effectively survived on the remittances from the Gulf, okay, largely. Tourism as a source of revenue is a relatively recent phenomenon. So that's point number one. Two, I think the question is what India can do for them. What India can certainly do for them is to at least explore the possibility of a dual citizenship so that the bonds are retained. The passport at the end of the day is an extremely powerful document, and it is a marker of identity. And therefore, an Indian passport continues to give them an incentive to at least ensure that their children take an interest in India. Right. Otherwise, second and third generation Americans are bound to ask this question. That is effectively, let's say, a vacation place for me, or at best for a pilgrimage. Beyond that, I have really no interest in that particular country. It is of ornamental use in my life.
Right.
Okay. So dual citizenship is something that we must consider. And when you invest in that direction, you effectively get an opportunity to expect something in return, which is you now start telling them, why don't you now move beyond merely earning your livelihood in the countries of your residence? Why don't you start taking part in public life? And why don't you become a powerful diaspora so that you can benefit the country of your adoption as well as the country of origin without necessarily undermining each of these each of their interests. You cannot be accused of dual loyalty. It's American concept for dual citizenship to benefit those who are of Indian origin. Okay, so that is the first concrete step that India must take, or at least start exploring as an option, whatever the caveats and disclaimers may be against that particular option. And then I think we will then know how to use diaspora effectively. India has a diaspora in numbers, but I don't think that diaspora has thought of itself as a community, as a single block, nor has it effectively flexed its muscles at a political level. We are perhaps, let's say, deep-seated occupants of the Silicon Valley, but I don't know how much of our representation translates to power in the Washington circles. That is what I think we need to start looking at.
No, true. Very great.
China has done much better at that, and even Saudi Arabia has done better, and the Muslim world has done better. I don't think India has done as much.
Right. I think that is definitely a route we should consider, translating our tech IT power into, more like legislative, political representation, especially in America, I think would do us a lot of good for sure. So on that same note, I want to ask you a quick question. Incidentally, I want to ask you a question about kind of the US-India relationship akin to the US-Israel relationship. So incidentally, for our listeners, I've actually met and conversed with Sai, both in the United States and in Israel. And one thing, if you remember, in Israel, they told us about a program called Birthright, which is it's financed largely by American Jews. And I think they constitute maybe a third of the funding. So American Jews pretty much, finance these, like it's all expenses paid trip in collaboration with the Israeli government for Jews outside of Israel to get this all expenses paid trip to Israel to, kind of visit their motherland, so to speak, trace the roots of Judaism. And obviously it's done for a multitude of reasons, which we don't need to explore right now. But a big reason is to build a sense of Jewish identity and pride. I think there's no shying away from that. So what I wanted to ask you a question on is American Indians and American Hindus are just as monetarily powerful, maybe not as politically, but just as monetarily powerful as American Jews. Especially, in, like you said, Silicon Valley and the whole tech sphere. We are very, very economically prosperous there. Do you see potential for American Hindus and American Indians organizing in collaboration with the Indian government a form of birthright for the Indian context, wherein we bring, say, Indian Americans, Indian Europeans, Indian Australians, whatever, Indian Gulf state people back to India for, say, like a 2-week trip, like a cultural trip, wherein they go to, say, just our landmark sites, some landmark temples, landmark pilgrimage centers, in addition to, like, some of our happening urban cities, wildlife sanctuaries, so much that we have to offer. Do you think, A, there's potential for that, and B, like, how will it benefit us in the long run?
In principle, I think that's a wonderful idea, and I certainly would get on board with it. But there are 2 or 3 caveats there. One, the Jewish nation, when it invites its diaspora, is very clear that it wants to showcase its Jewish identity and reinforce it. Okay. Therefore, there is a clarity in its own identity, which even translates to its representation in these programs. And what does it translate to? Now, the comparison with Israel at this point is premature, is that Israel has had 70 years of existence as unadulterated Jewish existence in its identity. And it has gone to the extent of even passing nation-state laws which legalize that particular position, constitutionalize that particular position.
Right.
Okay. India has a very confused sense of identity. Okay. Right. It doesn't have a civilizational vision. There are islands in the country who actually have that vision and who know what the Indian Constitution stands for, who understand it in its true spirit. But otherwise, most of it is actually similar to the kind of nonsense that the publication called Haaretz mouths in Israel, or what the New York Times mouths in United States.
Right.
Okay? So if you want to disseminate and if you want to project, first address the problems in your home, set your house in order, then you project. Until then, you're not in a position to do that.
No, that's a great analogy. I think that sheds a lot of clarity. It doesn't make sense to have a big party for guests to come visit you if your house is messy, right? So
correct.
I completely agree with that. So one thing I did want to now, again, related to our conversation, one thing I want to talk to you about is this issue of soft power, right? Right. I think obviously using these terms kind of loosely, but by and large, like the United States enjoys its, hegemonic standing in the world. In great part owing to its soft power, right? Like everyone loves movies, everyone likes Netflix, people enjoy US music, and so on and so forth. They've done a good job of projecting like, hey, our culture is great, so on and so forth. What do you think, like some areas that we as Indians can use to project our soft power to the globe is? Like, hey, you know what? Like our identity is really, really cool. How do we increase that sex appeal of Indic culture overseas? Like what should be our Hollywood? What should be our Netflix, so to speak?
I think the essential point that India is a knowledge-based society, and it is a society that worships the pursuit of truth, is something that needs to be presented. And for far too long, I think we've spent too much of time and energy convincing the rest of the world that we're a pacifist nation. I don't think that should be the focus at all. Right. Because I don't think pacifism is necessarily right in all circumstances, nor is it necessarily valid in every situation. So we are a culture that seeks peace, but we are a culture we know how that knows how to enforce peace using force wherever is warranted, but peace for the sake of pursuit of truth, peace as an end in itself and also as the enabler and facilitator of pursuit of truth. So if America calls pursuit of happiness its manifest destiny, India's manifest destiny is pursuit of truth.
Right.
Okay. And pursuit of knowledge. So that is something that we must effectively present, and which effectively shows what you have to speak about our contributions to mathematics, our contributions to astronomy, our contributions to music. There is no concept of music in this artificial creature called Pakistan had it not been for the fact that it was a part of India at some point. Okay, right, they don't have any identity independent of the Indian identity. Their culture is completely appropriated. That can be said of the entire Southeast Asian region. Okay, or this part of the Asian continent. Yeah. So I think it's important for us to identify these aspects. Two, yoga, I think, is a huge success on that front, except, again, I'm sorry to be the party pooper, that now you have allowed yoga to become an industry independent of its Hindu identity and roots. Right. Okay. And I was recently informed by a better informed individual, a scholar, in fact, that yoga industry effectively generates $80 billion. Okay. And I don't know how much of that, yeah, that's huge. And imagine how much of that cash drain is actually wetting India, not too much. Right. Okay. And traditional knowledge, whatever belongs to us, must ultimately benefit us. Of course, it should benefit the rest of the world as well. But as people who subscribe to so-called notions of intellectual property, the West must respect India's intellectual property. Right. Okay. So that's one. Two, I do believe that our music has, yeah.
One way, so the $18 billion figure, is the yoga industry around the world raking in those numbers, or is it the yoga industry exclusively in America?
I'm not sure of that. I think it's perhaps exclusively in America. Oh, okay. From what I understand.
All right. Okay. My apologies for interjecting. Please continue.
No problem. So the second thing is, I think there is a huge fan base for Indian traditional music. Right. Okay. And I think YouTube is effectively opening our eyes to the fact that there are so many people who are open to the nuance of Indian music, much more than perhaps deracinated urban Indians are themselves. Right. Okay. So it could achieve two things. The projection of soft power strategically could translate to reinforcing its importance in within India itself. Okay. Because Swami Vivekananda once said that we will come to such a pathetic stage that the West will have to come and teach you yoga, Vedas, and everything else. And you will then realize that this is our own knowledge that is being taught back to us. So I think we're slowly gravitating in that particular direction. So if you're not able to convince the native audience through our own media and channels, perhaps we should get a couple of people from the outside to speak for us. Maybe that's when we listen to people, because a couple of shades lighter complexion makes a huge difference to us.
I think it's something which really, during my time in America as well, I have only gratitude and respect for my time in the US, but I don't think not even once did I ever shy away from my Indian identity. And it's sad that I cannot say the same for a lot of my Indian peers, so I think you're right in that aspect for sure. But no, that's a great insight as always. So I want to kind of switch registers to, what was a pretty hot button issue is the Citizenship Act, right?
Right.
The Citizenship Act. I know obviously you've I've been following your content on the same. You've obviously been very vocal about it. One thing which, first, before I get any further, could you just spend 30 seconds articulating for the benefit of our listeners, given that a lot of our listeners are outside India and a lot of them will be consuming content that perpetuates the narrative that, oh, this is a xenophobic law, this is, a racist law, so on and so forth. Could you spend just 30 seconds to a minute, maybe addressing that for the benefit of our non-Indian listeners?
So here are irrefutable facts, which are verifiable through sources in public domain. One, India does not have a refugee law. Okay. India has only a law which recognizes citizenship and a law which recognizes who's a foreigner, and therefore the concept of an illegal migrant. Therefore, every person who enters India without valid documents or overstays his welcome translates to an illegal migrant for practical purposes. Okay, and therefore, it is up to India to ask itself whether that person deserves to be treated as a refugee, because not every illegal migrant can immediately jump into the basket of a refugee. The definitions are different, the requirements are different in international law as well as in domestic law. Unless and until there is proof of persecution on accepted, let's say, parameters or metrics, there is no question of anybody being treated as a refugee. Okay, so the first distinction is that we, as a sovereign country, reserve to ourselves the right to strike a distinction between who qualifies as a refugee and who does not. Okay, and since we do not have a refugee law, we effectively have an ad hoc position which is on a case-to-case basis. There is nothing anywhere which requires us to have a refugeeship statute. That is entirely up to us. That is for us to decide, taking into account multiple considerations, because we live in a fundamentally non-democratic, volatile neighborhood, and perhaps one of the most volatile regions in the world. Yeah. Okay, and as perhaps the sole functional, Sorry, go ahead.
No, my apology. I was just saying, like, easily top 3 volatile regions on the planet, easily.
Correct. And as the sole surviving, functional, credible democracy with such diversity in this volatile region, I think people must give us credit for that before accusing us of Nazism, fascism, Hitler state, and whatnot. These are, in fact, if at all they have to level these allegations must be leveled at those countries which have forced India to formulate its Citizenship Amendment Act. Okay, if Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Pakistan were capable of being humane, secular, fair, reasonable, and just to their non-Muslim populations, India would not have had to formulate this particular law. And most importantly, more than non-Muslim populations, there is an acute hatred for Indic faith systems, which is very, very, reminiscent of perhaps the medieval ages. And it continues to occupy center stage in these countries in one way or the other. And therefore, India has been forced and constrained to come out with this law, which has been long in the offing. It was discussed when the constitution was first being drafted between 1946 and 1949, and it was vocally supported by the leaders of that time. Unfortunately, it was never given effect to. Therefore, this dispensation has given effect to it for the very first time. I have a lot of criticisms against this dispensation, but because of this particular issue, I'm forced to support this particular dispensation's position on the issue. Unfortunately, what has happened is that a lot of people who are incapable of nuance have effectively called those who support the CAA supporters of the government, because they have not been able to strike a distinction between support of an issue or support to an issue and support of the government blindly. Okay, right. There is nothing that the Citizenship Amendment Act does to minorities, religious minorities of India. There is nothing that is evil. There is nothing that is remotely diabolical, nothing adverse at all. It addresses non-Muslim minorities of 3 specific countries, which are Islamic republics. Right. And where there is either state-sponsored or state-endorsed, tacit, overt, or covert persecution of Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, Buddhists, Parsis, and Christians.
Fair enough. No, thank you. I feel like that's a good enough summary for, both our Indian as well as global listeners. So kind of just to, play a bit of devil's advocate over here is, I agree completely with your analysis, but I believe that under Pakistan law, right, the Ahmadiyya sect are technically not recognized as Muslims as well. Like, they constitute a non-Muslim minority too. So again, just to play devil's advocate, I'm
right.
What your thoughts are. Given that they constitute the non-Muslim minority in Pakistan, would they not qualify for Citizenship Act benefits here in India?
No, there's a good reason. And I think the focus is not about them being Muslim or non-Muslim. The issue is about Ahmadiyyas as a community continue to have an anti-Hindu animus. They continue to have a serious problem with the Hindu identity. Right. And therefore, their strife with the rest of the Muslim community within Pakistan is an internal issue. Okay. we don't need to beat around the bush that India is the natural homeland for people of Indic faith systems of Indian origin. Therefore, India can look out for them. And if you look at the history of the partition, the Ahmadiyya community actively supported, advocated, and acted on the ground for the partition of India, giving effect to the two-nation theory. Their websites, which are available even today, which speak of the Ahmadiyya community, continue to harp on the fact that despite being founders of Pakistan based on the two-nation theory, they are today reduced to a marginalized minority. So you have to understand that they may have given up, let's say, or they may be persecuted today for their Ahmadiyya identity, but they have not given up their endorsement of the two-nation theory, which effectively translates to Hindu hatred, and that effectively affects 80% of the Indian population, or at the very least 70% of the Indian population. From a security standpoint, whether they are Muslims, treated as Muslims, not treated as Muslims, it is irrelevant. Right. We cannot permit those people to enter this country unless and until our security apparatus gives it a green flag. Now it is a red flag, and therefore it is not possible. Remember one thing though, what the Citizenship Act does is that it treats members of a community as members of a community. However, individuals of a community can still knock the doors of India for citizenship through the traditional channels. Right. And the Citizenship Act, all it does is that it reduces certain requirements for those 6 groups from those 3 countries, and therefore it provides an accelerated process. The non-accelerated channel or pathway or process is available even to the Ahmadiyya from Pakistan. For them to insist that we are entitled to the same expedited treatment, sorry, you're a non-citizen of India. You don't have any right to dictate to India. You have no constitutional rights under our constitution to expect this kind of a treatment. You have no rights under any international law to expect India to tailor its refugee laws or its refugee initiatives in accordance with their wishes and whims. That's not going to happen under any circumstances.
Right. No, fair enough. I think that focus on our security, is, I think, of paramount importance that maybe people miss in the details. Would you say that there are any parallels to kind of what, the backlash that both the Modi administration, as well as here in India, as well as the Trump administration in the United States, receive in terms of, prioritizing, and I'm paraphrasing over here, but do you think in terms of prioritizing security over this blindly take all immigrants to our country mindset, right? Which certain segments on what side of the aisle have been advocating for. Do you think that there are similarities between the two, and India and the United States could use this time to forge a security alliance on the same?
That would actually reinforce the existing myths and stereotypes, according to me. Okay? Because America's reasons, America's justifications, and America's position on illegal migration is very, very different. Okay? Whereas India's reasons and justifications are very, very different. And I don't think India's legitimate position based on a history of persecution that Hindus and non-Muslims have received in this part of the world must be conflated with America's positions towards, let's say, Mexicans or any other community for that matter. Right. Okay. So I would say that the issue of illegal migration is much more real because it is existential. It is based on survival as far as the Indian subcontinent is concerned. Right. Okay. And India must retain its individual narrative on this. For India to hope to convince the rest of the world through a partnership with America would be fundamentally a proof of lack of conviction in its own positions, which I don't think what it must do. For a nation that aspires to be at the very least a regional superpower, it must have the ability to disseminate its own position and defend it. Right. So I wouldn't want that kind of an alliance at all, because then it would effectively we would walk into the trap of the other side, which wants to paint us in the same light as Trump. Sorry, we don't agree with everything that Mr. Trump says. And most importantly, our positions on immigration are independent, indigenous, and sui generis, based on our conditions.
Right. And just one last question on that. No, that's good. I think that's a very good answer. One quick question on that. Do you not, however, think while we should tackle them, as two distinct issues, because Trump's and Modi's reasons may be different and the context of illegal immigration in America is different from that of India, given these realities, and despite these realities, do you not think India could, say, benefit from something like an information sharing agreement with the United States. Like if the US has information and data on potential invasions at our borders on Punjab and Kashmir, do you not think we could benefit from having that information shared with us?
From whatever little I understand, I believe that there is a significant amount of intelligence and information sharing already going on. Okay. But the reason why I would be extremely wary of extending it beyond that is that if United States does not want to justify its positions on immigration to India, I don't think India must necessarily justify its position to United States.
Right.
Okay? I would rather spend more time in building a civilizational partnership with my immediate neighbors,
right.
People in the Southeast Asian region with whom I share millennia-old relationships and who are in a much better position to understand what India is currently witnessing. And Sri Lanka, Burma, or rather Myanmar, Bhutan, Nepal, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Japan,
Thailand.
These are the countries, Thailand, these are the countries that I would certainly want to invest in the long run because they understand us. And as, let's say, denizens of the East and with a shared civilizational relationship, it would be much easier to talk to them and build an alliance. Going back to the US would effectively mean going against what I said all along, which is to subscribe to Eurocentric or Western-centric notions of what is right and what is wrong.
Right. No, that's a very, very interesting outlook, focusing on building our Eastern alliances and Eastern partnerships. I think it's a very, very interesting outlook. So, with that...
Sorry, there was a slight issue with my mic, but with that, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you so much, Sai, for what was an amazing conversation. And I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. Sai's Twitter is in the link in my description, as is my YouTube channel where this video will be uploaded to, if you prefer to listen there. Also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Anish202BLR if you want more snippets and previews of what to expect in future episodes of the podcast. As always, thank you for listening. You can DM me on those platforms on Insta or Twitter as well if you want to reach out. Do you have any comments or any suggestions for future episodes? I'd love to hear from you guys. Let me know. Everything's in the description. Peace and look forward to seeing you guys soon.